Hey, hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson. Today we're listening to Blood and Lust, the new detectives.
A teenage girl is found murdered in her Indiana home, and police soon suspect that she is not this killer's only victim. Detectives race the clock to track a serial killer across the country before he strikes again. Someone is targeting elderly women in a gated California community. With no witnesses and little physical evidence, investigators struggle to find a link between the murders. For homicide investigators, it's difficult to predict when and where a serial killer will strike next. But with the help of forensic examiners, they can isolate tiny clues that can lead them to the killer who is driven by bloodlust. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. An hour's drive south of Chicago, Griffith, Indiana is home to 18,000 people. People drawn here by the quiet lifestyle and the low crime rate. Around 7 p.m. on October 13th, 1987, 15-year-old Christine Gallagher returned home from school. She called out to her older sister, Wendy, but there was no response.
Hey, Wendy.
Though Mrs. Gallagher was still at work, Wendy should have been home from school hours ago. Christine checked the bedroom.
Oh, Wendy.
There, she found 16-year-old Wendy's lifeless body on the floor. Griffith police and crime scene units were immediately dispatched to the Gallagher apartment. The distraught teenager was taken to a squad car as police made their way into the residence. Inside the apartment, the living room was neat and orderly. But in the bedroom, police discovered the gruesome scene. The semi-nude victim had been gagged, her hands tied behind her back with a bedsheet. She'd been stabbed repeatedly. It appeared that she had been sexually assaulted, but no biological evidence was recovered. For Lieutenant John Mowry of the Griffith Police Department, the scene was difficult to comprehend.
When I walked into that apartment and saw the victim, Wendy Gallagher, and saw the savage manner in which she had been killed, I've never seen anything like that. I was on the department 17 years prior to that, have investigated other homicides, never seen anything that even comes descriptively close to the way that scene was.
Investigators began to methodically process the scene. Next to the window, they discovered blood spatter on the wall and curtain. Hoping to find prints, they treated the wall with silver nitrate, a chemical that reacts to the oils found in fingers and palms. Then they scanned the area with a light source. A partial palm print and more blood spatter emerged. The section of wall was removed and forwarded to the crime lab. In the living room, investigators collected a drinking glass with smudged fingerprints. They also found a denim jacket hanging on the back of a chair. Searching the pockets, they found a driver's license. It belonged to a teenage boy with a local address. On the kitchen counter, detectives recovered a woman's purse. There was no identification inside. Outside, Christine told police that her father had dropped her off after a school swim meet. She said that since their parents' recent divorce, she and Wendy would sometimes be by themselves after school until Mrs. Gallagher returned from work soon after. As Christine continued answering questions, one of the investigators brought out the purse found in the kitchen. Christine said it was hers. She added that when she arrived home, she didn't remember seeing Wendy's purse anywhere. Then, Mrs. Gallagher returned from work and learned about the murder. Overwhelmed with grief, she told police she couldn't believe anyone would want to kill her daughter. Wendy was such a beautiful and cheerful girl. When shown the ID from the denim jacket, the Gallaghers recognized the boy immediately. He was Wendy's boyfriend. Looking for any clue to the killer's identity, examiners at the Lake County Crime Lab began to analyze the prints recovered from the Gallagher apartment. They started with a smudged drinking glass. When dusted with black powder, two distinct sets of fingerprints were revealed. Analysis of the arches, whorls, and loops that makes each print unique established that one set was Wendy's. But the second set of prints didn't match any of the Gallaghers. Next, examiners turned to the section of wall removed from Wendy's bedroom. To preserve the fragile drywall, they worked from photographs. Again, the partial palm print didn't match samples taken from any of the Gallaghers. Its position on the drywall in relation to the blood found around the window led evidence technician Ronald Latch to conclude that whoever left it had been startled.
He put one hand on the wall and looked out the curtain because you could see blood on the edge of the curtain and on the wall, and looking out to see if somebody was coming. Maybe he heard a voice or a car door slam.
But the concern must have been short-lived. Crime scene analysis uncovered no signs of a forced entry or exit. It appeared that after committing this brutal murder, the killer calmly left the apartment, probably through the front door. Convinced that the unidentified prints were the key to revealing the killer's identity, investigators ran them through APIS, a computer database that holds millions of fingerprint records. But no matches were found. Detectives turned to Wendy's boyfriend for answers. They wanted to know why his jacket and ID were found in the Gallagher's apartment. The teenager explained that Wendy had been cold that day at school. He'd loaned her his jacket, and she'd worn it home. He said he was home with his parents during the time of the murder. He also told police he had no idea who could have hurt Wendy. She was very popular at school, where she was an honor student and a pom-pom girl. said Wendy was a lot of fun to be with, and he couldn't believe she was gone. Though he had a solid alibi, detectives fingerprinted him before letting him go. But analysis of his prints later confirmed his innocence. Police spent the next several days interviewing dozens of Wendy's friends and neighbors. Over 50 potential suspects were developed, but fingerprint analysis eliminated all of them. According to Detective Carl Grimmer, tensions in the small town grew as the investigation hit a dead end.
Within the community of Griffith, after this occurred, there's a lot of fear. We didn't know who we were looking for. We didn't know if we were looking for somebody that lived in our town, somebody in a neighboring town, or if it could have been a drifter.
But a week after the murder, police got a solid lead. A woman in Chicago had found Wendy's missing purse.
I understand you found the purse that we were been looking for.
The purse I bought it up in my purse.
She explained that her own purse had been snatched during an assault. When it was later recovered from a dumpster and returned, she opened it and found Wendy Gallagher's purse and ID stuffed inside. Then she'd heard about the murder in Griffith.
Down an alley, and this car pulls up.
The woman said that as she left work through the back door, a man with brown hair and a mustache jumped out of a blue car. He grabbed her and threatened her with a knife. As they struggled, the delivery truck pulled up. The assailant grabbed her purse and fled. But he had left behind valuable evidence. A witness who could identify him and a physical link to Wendy's murder. Police quickly released a composite sketch of the suspect, along with a description of his blue car. Over the next several weeks, they received many leads as a result, but none of them panned out. Despite the lack of progress, investigators refused to give up.
Everybody who had walked into that crime scene that night and saw Wendy, that's all the incentive you needed to keep going, to find out who had done that to her.
Griffith detectives had a composite sketch and fingerprints that could prove murder. But until they could identify their suspect, that evidence was meaningless. And all indications suggested that Wendy Gallagher was not going to be this killer's last victim. Several months had passed with little progress in the murder case of 16-year-old Wendy Gallagher. Though Griffith, Indiana police had a composite drawing of their suspect and prints recovered from the murder scene, his identity and his whereabouts remained unknown. As they struggled to keep the case alive, an improbable lead was called in by police in Pasco County, Florida, located more than 1,100 miles away from Griffith, Indiana.
Yes, method of operation.
While investigating the homicide of a 14-year-old girl there, Florida police believed that a resident had uncovered a connection to Wendy Gallagher's unsolved murder.
Who's the lead detective in this case?
That resident, Diane Collins, had just moved to Pasco County from Griffith, Indiana. As details of the Florida murder were made public, Diane immediately noticed similarities to the homicide in Griffith. The frighteningly familiar details compelled her to contact the police.
I was very much struck by the fact that this was another young teenage girl who was murdered in her home after school hours, just as Wendy was in the community I had just left.
Griffith police were skeptical that such a tenuous lead could impact their case, but they had little else to go on. They asked Pasco County investigators to forward the case files. According to police reports, in January 1988, 14-year-old Janet Clark was discovered in her bedroom by her younger brother shortly after 6 p.m. He and Mr. Clark had just returned home from running an errand. Janet had been home from school just a few hours. When police arrived, they found Janet's partially clad body gagged and bound, her hands tied together with a bed sheet. She'd been viciously knifed and raped. No prints had been found at the scene. And while DNA evidence was recovered during autopsy, investigators had no suspect to link it to. But now, Griffith detective Carl Grimmer realized that Diane Collins' instincts might have been dead on.
We thought it was a long shot that the two cases could be connected. But when we sat and studied the photos, studied the crime scenes, we became stronger and stronger in our belief that they probably were connected. It's just, you had to see it to see the similarities. It's almost like there was a signature.
Believing they were now searching for the same killer, the two departments began exchanging information. Pasco County, Florida police intensified their investigation. One of the Clark's neighbors recalled a man in the neighborhood around the time of Janet's murder. She had never seen him before. She described the man to a police sketch artist as being in his late 20s, with dark hair and a mustache. She believed that he was driving a late model red Corvette with Missouri license plates. Though the description of the vehicle was different, Griffith police couldn't ignore the striking similarities to their suspect. For Detective Mowry, there was little doubt that a serial killer was on the loose.
Time definitely was our enemy. We knew from what we had seen thus far how savage this person was. So we were virtually racing against a clock. We wanted to apprehend him as quickly as we could to prevent him from hurting anybody else.
But police knew that tracking a multi-state killer would be difficult. Until he struck again, all they could do was wait. And they feared this killer wouldn't make them wait very long. 2 months later, police in Beaumont, Texas responded to reports of gunfire at a local motel. Responding officers burst into the room where the shots had been heard. There, they discovered one of their own, Officer Paul Halsey, unconscious, the victim of a gunshot wound. The fallen officer had notified dispatch just a few minutes before that he was checking on the driver of a stolen vehicle who had just entered one of the rooms. Officer Halsey was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries proved fatal. He died a short while later. A witness at the motel stated that he heard gunfire and looked out his window. He saw a man with dark hair and a mustache speed away in a red Corvette. An all-points bulletin was issued for the red sports car. And within a few minutes, dispatchers reported that the vehicle had been spotted. The sports car was able to elude police for more than 20 miles. But the driver suddenly lost control, and the car swerved off the road. He fled into a wooded area on foot and disappeared. Texas authorities began preparing their manhunt for a suspected cop killer. Police in Indiana and Florida struggled to track down a serial killer who preyed upon young girls. Police 2,000 miles away in Beaumont, Texas, were on the trail of a suspected cop killer. Though the suspect had managed to escape, police had his abandoned red Corvette. Inside, they recovered a blood-stained .357 Magnum that had been recently fired. They also found stolen license plates, including a set from Missouri. Now their focus was on finding the driver. Detective Ray Beck of the Beaumont Police Department organized the man.
The word was out. So we had officers coming in from everywhere, just volunteering their time, their effort. So manpower was unbelievable.
Through witnesses, police learned that the suspect had jumped into a taxi and was headed toward Houston. Officers quickly caught up with the cab. The man believed responsible for the murder of Officer Halsey was taken into custody. The suspect, identified as 28-year-old Michael Lee Lockhart, was questioned at the Beaumont police station. He immediately confessed to shooting Officer Halsey, but offered no explanation. It seemed too easy. Robert Hobbs, an investigator with the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office, recalls Lockhart's interview.
He was very calm. He was very collected. We knew right away that that this was not our typical criminal in Southeast Texas, and then we would have our work cut out for us.
Their instincts told them Lockhart wouldn't have killed a police officer over a stolen car. There had to be more, a lot more, to this murder. Investigators fingerprinted Lockhart and collected hair samples. He was held without bond on capital murder charges. Ballistics results, bolstered by Lockhart's confessions, gave Beaumont detectives an airtight case. But Lockhart's quick confession still seemed too calculated, as if he might be trying to head off further investigation. Evidence recovered from Lockhart's motel room indicated he'd been on the move for months. Police had recovered several hotel and restaurant receipts from throughout the Midwest. But what was he running from? Hoping to find out, Detective Ray Beck wrote an article profiling Lockhart and details of Officer Halsey's murder for a national law enforcement magazine. The tactic paid off. A detective working the Janet Clark murder in Pasco County, Florida, read the article on Lockhart and Officer Halsey's murder. He then called the Beaumont Police Department. Detective Beck quickly understood why.
One of the missing links to their case was the fact that their red Corvette had Missouri license plates. And that was one of the pieces of evidence that we had here was Missouri license plates that we found in the Corvette.
Detective Beck next learned about the connection to Wendy Gallagher's murder. Investigators working that case in Griffith, Indiana, were immediately notified. They requested that Lockhart's prints be forwarded to the Lake County Crime Lab. Hoping they had the evidence they needed to prove murder, examiners went to work, comparing Lockhart's fingerprints to those recovered from the Wendy Gallagher crime scene. After scrutinizing and comparing both sets of prints, examiner Ronald Blatch was certain that Wendy's killer had been found.
The fingerprints we found at the scene put Michael Lee Lockhart in that apartment, and the palm prints put him right next to the body of the victim, where there was blood and on the curtain in the wall.
Nearly 8 months after Wendy Gallagher was found murdered in her home, investigators finally had the evidence they needed to charge Michael Lee Lockhart with her murder.
I felt a great sense of relief because I knew that he couldn't commit any more crimes. And I also felt happy that we would be able to contribute and help bring some semblance of closure to the Gallagher family.
On June 30th, 1988, DNA analysis confirmed that Lockhart had murdered and sexually assaulted Janet Clark in Florida. Working together, 3 police agencies had tied 3 seemingly unrelated murders to one predator. Based on the evidence, police believe that Lockhart traveled the country in search of his next victim.
Okay, Bill's right down the road.
He would prowl an area, hunting for vulnerable young victims. When he knew they were alone, he would con his way into their homes, where he would rape and murder them. Michael Lee Lockhart stood trial for murder in all 3 states. He was sentenced to death in each trial. In Texas, on December 9, 1997, Michael Lee Lockhart was executed for his crimes. It took the cooperative effort of 3 police departments to track a transient serial killer across the United States. But sometimes, murderers who stay in one place are just as hard for investigators to find. 75 miles from Los Angeles, Riverside County, California is a haven for retirees and people looking to escape the problems of urban life. But on February 16, 1994, a 911 call brought police from the Riverside County Sheriff's Office to a condo in the upscale community of Canyon Lake. There, investigators found the body of 86-year-old Norma Davis, slumped in an easy chair. A phone cord was wrapped around her throat, and knives protruded from her chest and neck. Investigators began searching the scene, looking for anything that would tell them who had murdered Norma Davis and why. Robbery appeared to be an unlikely motive. The victim still wore an expensive ring on her finger. A few desk drawers were open, but there were no signs of ransacking. Forensic technicians processed the body, looking for any stray hairs or fibers that the killer may have left behind. But from the position of the body, it was clear to California Department of Justice criminalist Alyssa Mayo Thompson that there was little interaction between the victim and killer.
She appeared to just be sitting in her chair as if she were perhaps reading or watching TV. It didn't appear that she had made much of a struggle or had attempted to get up from that chair.
That told investigators that Norma Davis most likely knew her killer. The knives were removed and sent to the crime lab to be tested for prints. A search of the condo confirmed that robbery was not a motive. On the kitchen floor, investigators found Norma's purse, still containing credit cards and cash. In the hallway, investigators spotted a faint shoe print on the floor. To get a better look, the room was darkened. Closer examination revealed that it was a sneaker print left in dust. And recovering such fragile evidence would be tricky. But in a crime scene that yielded few clues to the After thoroughly photographing the print, technicians carefully applied an adhesive gelatin to lift it. But the minute details of the print didn't survive the lift. It would be up to examiners to determine if there was a sufficient sample to do future comparisons when and if a suspect emerged. Outside, detectives talked to Alice Williams, who had found the victim. She stated that she had come over to pick up Norma for their weekly hair appointment. She let herself in when Norma didn't respond to her calls. That's when she discovered the body. She couldn't understand how such a thing could have happened in Canyon Lake. It was a gated community with round-the-clock security. Norma's ex-daughter-in-law, Mary Pierce, had also arrived at the scene. She too lived in Canyon Lake. She told investigators that she and Norma were very close. But as Mary continued describing Norma in greater detail, detectives glanced down and noticed she was wearing Nike sneakers. They asked if there was anyone close to Norma who would want her dead. Mary reacted with shock, insisting no relative could possibly be involved. But now, detectives weren't so sure. They turned to the crime lab for answers. But criminalists at the California Department of Justice Forensic Lab determined that all of the evidence recovered from the condo had been wiped clean of prints. They hoped the recovered shoe print could lead them to Norma's killer. For Ricky Elvin Cooksey, a criminalist with the Department of Justice Crime Lab in Riverside, shoe print evidence can carry investigators a long way.
A shoe print right at the crime scene can help investigators if we can identify what kind of shoe made that print, and there are databases that store that type of information. We can tell them what type of shoe they're looking for and size shoe they're looking for.
After reviewing hundreds of different sneaker tread designs, Cooksey believed that the print recovered from Norma Davis's home had been made by a Nike. He acquired a similar sneaker from the manufacturer and made test prints. The tread design was identical. Cooksey had determined that the suspect's print had been made by a size 6.5 Nike Air tennis shoe. For detectives, the news was not that encouraging. Tracking down a specific purchase of such a popular shoe would be next to impossible. The only thing that homicide detective Joe Greco could infer from the analysis was that the suspect was a small male, or possibly a woman. And he already had a potential suspect who fit that description.
We suspected the ex-daughter-in-law, Mary Pierce, because of the shoes that she was wearing when she came to the crime scene, and the brand of shoe matched the brand of shoe that we found in the doorway. And also, she was the caretaker. She was the obvious choice.
Police questioned Mary Pierce in greater detail, carefully watching her demeanor. Mary said her ex-mother-in-law was a wonderful, warm person who didn't have any enemies. Most days, she just watched her TV or read. After answering dozens of questions, it became clear to investigators that Mary was not involved in Norma's murder. Her cooperation and her grief were sincere.
I appreciate your time.
Detectives reviewed dozens of statements given by Norma's family, friends, and neighbors, but no one had any useful information. The case quickly threatened to go cold. With no suspects and no solid leads, it looked like Norma Davis's murder might never be solved. solved. In Riverside, California, the investigation into the stabbing and strangulation death of 86-year-old Norma Davis, killed in her Canyon Lake home, had ground to a halt.
Attention units, we have a possible homicide.
As investigators struggled to keep the case alive, another 911 call came in from residents of Canyon Lake. Another elderly woman had been found murdered in her home. There, police discovered 66-year-old June Roberts, dead on her office floor. And for everyone in the room, this crime scene looked disturbingly familiar. Though June Roberts had not been stabbed, she still wore an expensive ring and had a phone cord wrapped around her neck. Credit cards were scattered around her purse, but nothing appeared to be missing. For criminalist Alyssa Mayo Thompson, it was obvious that June Roberts and Norma Davis's murders were connected.
The type of crimes, both brutal homicides occurring within a few short days between each other in this area, led us to think that these two crimes may be linked.
Investigators scoured the home. A Bible caught detectives' attention. Inside was a handwritten prayer list. Norma Davis's name was on that list. The two victims were friends. But for Detective Greco, how they were connected to the killer was unclear. He could be certain about one thing, however. A serial killer was targeting elderly women in Canyon Lake.
This whole case is overwhelming in that that's not something that one in law enforcement comes across every day. It's a crime of serious violence, and it wasn't stopping. I mean, it was just the beginning.
And so far, this killer had made few mistakes. But a week after June Roberts' death, that all seemed to change. June Roberts' daughter brought police a statement from one of her mother's credit card companies. Someone had gone on a spending spree immediately after June's death, charging jewelry, clothing, and other merchandise. It was the break detectives were waiting for. Now they had a paper trail to follow. They started at a jewelry store, where the first purchase with the murdered victim's card had been made. The clerk vaguely recalled the transaction. She remembered that a blonde woman came into the store and purchased an expensive set of earrings. The woman charged the items and signed her name, June Roberts. The clerk couldn't provide enough detail for a composite sketch, but she gave investigators a Xerox copy of an identical pair of earrings. The blonde woman, whoever she was, had been linked to one of the victims. The next purchase on June Roberts' credit card came from a hair salon. A stylist there remembered the woman claiming to be June Roberts. She said the woman was in her mid-30s, with shoulder-length blonde hair, hazel eyes, and a medium build. She added that the woman had a young boy with her. According to her appointment book, his name was Jonathan Weaver. An artist was brought in to translate the stylist's description of the blonde woman into a composite sketch. Gradually, a face took shape. But police still didn't know how this woman fit into the murder. And they had no way to put a name to her face. Pursuing their only other lead, investigators began searching for the young boy, Jonathan Weaver, who had been at the hair salon with the blonde woman.
Dad.
They contacted area public schools and found a child with that name. They went to his address and waited. But when they spotted the boy and his mother arriving home, they realized the mother didn't resemble any of the descriptions. Questioning confirmed that the boy had never been to that salon, and neither recognized the woman in the composite.
No, I've never seen her.
Despite the setback, investigators refused to give up. The locations of the murders and the credit card purchases were all within a 5-mile radius of each other. Investigators knew their killer had to be hiding right under their noses.
Should be more purchases there. She made
Hoping to generate a lead, they decided to run a check of all violent crimes recently reported within that same area. The tactic turned up a possible clue. An elderly woman who owned an antique shop just blocks away from Canyon Lake had been recently assaulted.
And this young woman came in.
Dorinda Hawkins, still recovering in the hospital, had barely survived the attack. She told investigators that a blonde woman came into her antique shop to ask about framing. When she led the customer into the back to show her some samples, the woman suddenly attacked her from behind. Dorinda felt a rope tightening around her neck. She told detectives that she then began begging for her life.
You know, you can have whatever you want, take whatever you want. I have 8 children, let me live. And the suspect told her, I'm not doing this for the money.
Dorinda had been left for dead, but she managed to regain consciousness. When she came to, her red coiled key band that held the keys to the cash register was missing from her wrist. And the money from the register was also gone. When shown the composite, she positively identified the blonde as her assailant.
Yes.
It was now apparent to investigators that the suspect was not simply an accessory to the other crimes. She was the serial killer. And the rarest type of all, a woman. Investigators raced to put a name with the face on the composite sketch. Since Mary Pierce had known both of the murder victims, police hoped she might have also crossed paths with the killer.
Let me ask you this. Can you put a name to this face?
When shown the sketch, Mary said that the face kind of resembled her stepdaughter, Dana Sue Gray.
That's my stepdaughter.
As Mary described her stepdaughter, the pieces started to fall into place.
The information fit the description of the suspect that I was looking for, in that she had a key to the first victim's house. She knew the second victim. She had a pass to get into Canyon Lake, and she was familiar with the area.
Mary added that Dana owned a house in Canyon Lake.
So you do know those?
But Dana had just gone through a vicious divorce battle and was trying to sell the place because of the resulting financial ruin. Her job as a registered nurse was not enough to support the affluent lifestyle she had come to enjoy. The positive identification of the sketch and the information provided by Mary Pierce led detectives to obtain a warrant to search Dana Sue Gray's property. But that would take time. And given the suspect's propensity for violence, they didn't want to give her a chance to kill again. Undercover officers immediately put her under surveillance. Riverside County investigators continued looking into Dana Sue Gray's background. They learned that she was currently dating a man who had a young child named Jonathan Weaver, the same name as the child who had been at the hair salon. But this Jonathan Weaver was enrolled in private school. You remember that? Previously, detectives had only searched public school records. Later that afternoon, one of the officers picked up Dana's trail in nearby Sun City as she entered a bank. When she left a few minutes later, Dana was seen stuffing a large amount of cash into her purse. A few hours later, Riverside police had obtained their search warrant. Detective Greco briefed the team on the items of evidence they were looking for once they made their way inside the suspect's house.
We had receipts from the different locations that the purchases were made for these various items, so they knew exactly what they were looking for. Also, I had directed the searchers to collect all of the shoes within the residence because of obviously the first victim's the shoe print in the first victim's case.
In the early evening hours of March 16, 1994, Riverside County investigators took suspected serial killer Dana Sue Gray into custody. She was taken to the Riverside Police Station for questioning. Inside the residence, investigators uncovered a wealth of evidence. They located a red-coiled key wristband, identical to the one stolen from Dorinda Hawkins at the antique shop. They also found merchandise similar to items purchased with June Roberts' credit cards. Inside Dana's purse, police made an ominous discovery. There was $1,900 in cash and a checkbook in the name of Dora Beebe. The address on the checks was from Sun City. Though Dora Beebe's name meant nothing to investigators, they knew that Dana Sue Gray had been in Sun City earlier that day. The search continued into the bedroom. There, evidence technicians found a pair of Nike sneakers. The evidence was sent to the crime lab.
Hey, you understand why you're here, don't you?
At the police station, Dana Sue Gray appeared calm and unaffected. She denied killing or assaulting anyone.
I think it looks exactly like you.
She admitted using credit cards belonging to June and another woman, whose name she couldn't remember, but claimed she had found them lying next to a dumpster.
You know what? Can I see those earrings?
Investigators collected Dana's earrings, which appeared to be the ones purchased on June Roberts' credit card.
These look very familiar.
As the detective left the interview to process the earrings, another investigator was waiting to speak to him outside. There had been another murder. The M.O. was identical to the Norma Davis and June Roberts homicides. The latest victim had been killed earlier that day in her home, which was located in Sun City. Riverside, California police believed that the suspect in the murders of Norma Davis and June Roberts was finally in their custody. As they questioned Dana Sue Gray about the murders, detectives were informed that Dora Beebe, an elderly resident in nearby Sun City, had been found murdered. That crime scene bore the same signature as the other homicides in Canyon Lake. Detectives realized they had found cash and a checkbook in the name of Dora Beebe while searching Dana's house.
Is there anything else you may want to say?
Dana Sue Gray had killed again, just a short while before the surveillance on her began.
June Roberts' credit cards in the dumpster too.
Now, They needed to be certain that she would never be free to kill again. At the crime lab, examiners analyzed the sneakers recovered from Dana Sue Gray's bedroom. They were size 6.5 Nike Air sneakers, the same style and size as the print recovered from the Norma Davis crime scene. Analysis of the characteristics that distinguish one shoe print from another left investigators with little doubt that Dana Sue Gray's shoes had left the print in Norma's condo. Unable to explain away all of the evidence amassed against her, Dana Sue Gray had no choice but to confess to her crimes. Riverside County investigators believe that Dana Sue Gray was driven over the edge by her financial misfortunes that resulted from her divorce. Angry and envious, she chose affluent victims, sometimes strangers, but mostly friends and relatives, as targets for murder. To avoid the death penalty, Dana Sue Gray pled guilty to the multiple murders. She was given 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole.
When I think of Dana Sue Gray, the first thing that comes to mind, for me anyway, is evil. It's just evil.
There are usually patterns to serial murder, though they're often hard to detect. Only time, patience, and meticulous forensic science can delve into the unknown and finally bring them to light. But ultimately, that's what detectives need to stop the killers who are driven by bloodlust. In Florida, a young woman is hit by a train. But what looks like a suicide might be a killer covering his tracks. A woman disappears from her Arizona home. With no body, police must rely on a few drops of blood to determine her fate. In California, police are called to the scene of a grisly double homicide. Only forensic examiners can prove whether it was the result of self-defense or cold-blooded murder. Some killers go to great lengths to manipulate a crime scene. But the truth is hard to disguise, and forensic examiners can see through the deception, especially when it's written in tainted blood. Around 4 a.m. on December 5th, 1993, a freight train was passing through the small community of Crestview, Florida. On an isolated stretch, the engineer noticed something lying across the tracks up ahead. It looked like a human body. He frantically sounded the whistle and struggled to stop the train. Underneath the 120-ton train, he discovered the lifeless body of a woman. The engineer quickly radioed in for help. Within minutes, police and emergency personnel from the Crestview Police Department were dispatched to the scene. The The young female victim had suffered massive head and chest wounds. She was partially covered by a black trench coat that was stained with blood. Police began searching for any form of identification to tell them who this woman was. They found nothing. Blood found pooled on the tracks and on some rocks just feet away from where the victim came to rest suggested the impact point. A few hairs and tiny drops of blood were found at the front of the train. But investigators found no blood smears on the tracks leading up to the victim's body. When questioned, the engineer told police that as he worked to stop the train, he believed that he made eye contact with the woman lying on the tracks. She never even flinched as the train approached. She just seemed to be staring at him. Before leaving the scene, evidence technicians photographed the area. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined the cause of death to be severe trauma to the unidentified victim's head and chest. She had suffered multiple skull fractures and a broken rib. To the medical examiner, all of the injuries were consistent with having been caused by the train. With no obvious signs of foul play noted during autopsy, investigators began looking for other explanations behind the tragedy. For Chief Maxie Barrow, there seemed to be only one.
We were thinking that it could possibly be a suicide. It could be somebody who was depressed and laid down on the railroad track and let a train run over.
To confirm their suspicions, investigators first had to identify the young woman. Several local residents believed she was 24-year-old Sherry Morrow, who lived with her husband less than a mile from the train tracks. Police went to the address. There, they were met by John Morrow, Sherry's husband, and the couple's roommate. Investigators showed the husband a photograph of the victim. John Morrow couldn't believe what he was seeing. The woman lying dead on the railroad tracks was his wife, Sherry. Morrow said that he and Sherry fought the night before. She believed he was flirting with another woman who was at a party at the couple's house. She became enraged. John followed her outside, determined to convince her that she was mistaken. They walked up the street to a payphone. She was cold, so John gave her his trench coat. Despite his efforts, Sherry remained angry and seemed depressed. John returned home, believing the best thing he could do would be to leave her alone. He thought that Sherry called a friend to come pick her up. John never imagined that she would take her own life. The couple's roommate corroborated John's story. The husband's account, in addition to the autopsy finding, left investigators with no reason to doubt the suicide theory. The investigation into Sherry Morrow's death was ready to be closed. The following day, however, Sherry Morrow's mother came in to speak with police. She could not accept that her daughter had taken her own life. John, she said, had had numerous affairs that Sherry found out about. As a result, Sherry had decided to end the turbulent marriage. Recently, she had begun searching for her own place so she could be closer to her mother. And though Sherry was upset to learn of her husband's infidelities, her mother was certain that she would never have killed herself. In fact, Sherry was prepared for a costly divorce, which John desperately wanted to avoid.
It's not unusual for the family of a suicide victim to determine that, or to say that they didn't commit suicide. But in the case of this victim, her mother was pretty convincing to me that that this victim didn't do that and wouldn't have done that.
Despite their new suspicions, investigators found no evidence suggesting that Sherry Morrow had met with foul play. Almost a month after she was discovered along the railroad tracks, the young woman was laid to rest. Over the next several years, investigators interviewed dozens of Sherry's friends, looking to uncover proof that she had been murdered. But they found nothing. The investigation into Sherry Morrow's death ground to a halt. The case was handed over to Crestview Police Lieutenant Jerome Worley. Determined to breathe new life into the investigation, he began re-interviewing the couple's friends and associates, starting with their roommate. The roommate again corroborated the story John had given 2 years earlier. On the night Sherry died, he said John followed her after she stormed out of the house in anger. But he returned soon after and never left the house again. Detectives sensed that the roommate wasn't telling the truth. Under threat of prosecution, he changed his story. John, he said, was sick of his wife, and he often bragged about how easy it would be to kill her and to make her death look like a suicide or an accident. He said that on the night Sherry died, John was gone for hours after leaving with her. When he returned, John was agitated. His knuckles were red. And he told the roommate, "It's done." Though the roommate's testimony confirmed investigators' suspicions that John Morrow was involved in his wife's death, Lieutenant Worley knew it wouldn't be enough to prove murder.
The roommate would be contradicting himself with the new statement, and it would just be his word against the husband's word in court. So we knew we'd have to have some physical evidence to prove the case.
But with the victim laid to rest and little evidence recovered from the scene, finding proof of murder would not be easy. For nearly 3 years, police in Crestview, Florida struggled to make sense of the death of 24-year-old Sherry Morrow. Though all of the evidence suggested she had taken her own life by lying in front of an oncoming train, investigators suspected that her husband, John Morrow, had murdered her. But they didn't have a shred of proof. The investigators forwarded what little evidence they had to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's crime lab in Pensacola. There, examiner Jan Johnson, an expert in bloodstain pattern interpretation, began examining photographs of the scene and the victim's clothes. Starting at the place where Sherry was struck by the train, Johnson began analyzing the bloodstains.
Generally speaking, if you would have the body lying on a railroad track and the body's still, there's no movement. So therefore, when the train would strike the victim, you would have spattered blood at that point of impact.
But in the photographs, there was no blood spatter at that spot. The blood was pooled. For Johnson, the only way to explain the findings was that Sherry was already bleeding when she laid down on the tracks. The lack of any blood smeared along the tracks leading up to Sherry's body was also troubling.
If it was a train striking a woman lying on the railroad tracks, I would expect to see a trail of blood leading from the point of impact to the final resting place.
In fact, No bleeding had occurred from any of the wounds caused by the train. That would only make sense if she was dead at the point of impact.
Once your heart stops, the blood flow ceases. So therefore, any injury that occurs after that fact, you will have very little bloodshed.
But if the train hadn't killed her, the question remained, what had? To find out, Johnson began analyzing the bloodstains found on the victim's clothes. She found blood spatter on the victim's t-shirt that didn't correspond to any of the head injuries noted in the original autopsy report. The size and the location of the spatter on the t-shirt was consistent with a specific type of injury.
If I had not known this was a train case and just received the clothing solely alone in the laboratory, I would have clearly thought someone had been beaten just by looking at the clothing. Because again, we've got the spatter pattern on the t-shirt, and this would be consistent with someone being beaten, stabbed, something of that nature.
Johnson passed on her findings to Crestview Police. The forensic analysis convinced detectives that Sherry Morrow had been murdered. To take this case before a jury, however, they needed to find the fatal injuries that had somehow gone unnoticed years earlier. 3 years after she was laid to rest, Sherry's remains were exhumed and forwarded to the medical examiner for a second autopsy. A new medical examiner began looking for evidence of homicide. On the back of the victim's skull, he found injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. And the wounds were not consistent with any of the injuries caused by the train. Medical examiner Dr. Michael Berkman next reviewed the original autopsy photos looking for any other abnormalities. He noticed strange bruising on the victim's neck that had not been noted in the original autopsy reports. X-rays revealed the presence of a broken hyoid, a bone in the neck located at the base of the tongue. Dr. Berkman didn't believe that the train could have caused the injury.
It would be extremely unlikely that the train could have struck her in such a way to fracture the hyoid and leave the jaw intact, because it is such a protected structure up high in the neck, back behind the jawbone.
The most reasonable explanation for the broken hyoid was that Sherry Morrow had been strangled. The blunt force trauma injuries found on the skull and the broken hyoid bone gave investigators the evidence they needed to prove that Sherry Morrow had been the victim of a homicide. And though investigators suspected that her husband, John Morrow, had committed the murder, they needed to find a way to link him to the crime scene. Though several years had gone by, police tracked down all of the railroad engineers who had passed through the area on the night Sherry was murdered. One immediately recognized photographs of John and Sherry Morrow. The couple, he said, were walking dangerously close to the tracks. They appeared to be having a bitter argument, seemed oblivious to his warnings. The engineer specifically remembered that the man, identified as John Morrow, had been wearing a black trench coat. On April 29, 1997, John Morrow was placed under arrest and charged with first-degree murder. Though he maintained his innocence, police believed that when Sherry decided to end the marriage, the stress of a divorce was too much for him to bear. As the couple argued while walking along the railroad tracks, John grabbed a blunt instrument and struck Sherry in the back of the head. But when she failed to lose consciousness, he finished the job by beating and then strangling her, breaking her hyoid bone in the process. Then he laid her bleeding body on the tracks and covered her with a blood-spattered trench coat. Sherry likely died within a few minutes. A jury convicted John Morrow of murder and sentenced him to life in prison without parole. John Morrow tried to deceive investigators by disguising his victim's cause of death. In a suburban community just north of Phoenix, Arizona, investigators would have to prove murder without the victim's body. On the evening of June 4th, 1989, Maricopa County Sheriff's deputies were called to the home of Earl and Ruby Morris. The couple's daughter, Cindy, was concerned that something had happened to her 49-year-old mother, Ruby. The two had made plans to meet that day, but Ruby failed to show up. When Cindy stopped by to check on her, she found her parents' bedroom was unusually messy. And she noticed that their .22 caliber handgun was missing. She said that her father, Earl, was currently in Los Angeles, California, but he would be back early the next day. But by the following morning, neither Ruby nor her husband, Earl, had returned home. Maricopa County Sheriff's Lieutenant Lee Luganbuehl was asked to look into the case. After reviewing the daughter's statements, he agreed to open a missing persons investigation.
Well, the daughter, Cindy, is supposed to meet her for lunch that day, and she never showed up. And this was kind of unusual for Mom. Mom was a very prompt person, would always meet her appointments, and she was very neat around the house also. So there were some things that were out of place at the house that was just not like Ruby.
Later that afternoon, the detective returned to the Morris residence to interview family members. When asked about her mother and father's relationship, Cindy told police that her parents' 30-year marriage had turned ugly in recent months.
What is this, Earl?
Earl had been caught having an affair. Upset and angry, Ruby began threatening to end the marriage and vowed to financially ruin her husband. Earl, a successful 49-year-old accountant, promised her that would never happen. But Cindy couldn't imagine that her father was capable of physical violence. As the questioning continued, Earl Morris returned from his trip. Cindy commented that he wasn't driving his own car. Earl explained that his car, an El Camino, had broken down some 200 miles from home on the drive back from Los Angeles. After several hours stranded on the road, he managed to hitch a ride to Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. There, Earl said he rented a car to get home. But almost immediately, the detective was suspicious of Earl's story.
I looked at his clothes and his general demeanor too. He was neat. He didn't appear to be out, trying to flag down a car. He was all put together.
The detective also noticed new airport tags on Earl's luggage, suggesting he had flown, not driven, from California. And the luggage tags originated from San Diego, not Los Angeles. With his suspicions raised, the investigator questioned Earl about Ruby's disappearance. Though he couldn't explain why the couple's .22 caliber gun was missing, he seemed unconcerned about his wife's whereabouts. Ruby, he said, would often take off for days on end without a word.
Earl told me he didn't think it was unusual for Ruby to be gone for a couple of days, that she had the wherewithal, credit cards, be able to go out, visit other people, and to leave. So he, again, was saying like it was no big deal that she was gone.
Investigators felt differently. Looking to corroborate Earl's story, they began searching the interstates for his broken-down El Camino. But hours of driving turned up no signs of the vehicle, and there were no records of it having been towed. An APB was issued for the car. A short while later, Earl Morris's El Camino was located. It was found nearly 400 miles away, parked near the San Diego airport. San Diego authorities impounded the vehicle and arranged for it to be transported back to Arizona.
All right, thanks. Bye.
For investigators, it was now clear that Earl Morris's story was a lie. To find out what he was hiding, they obtained a search warrant. Later that evening, police returned to his residence. Having observed no obvious signs of foul play, investigators began scouring the bedroom for trace amounts of evidence. They discovered several bloodstains on the carpet near the bed. Maricopa County Sheriff's Crime Lab Supervisor James Serpa noticed something odd about their appearance.
We saw visible signs that the carpet nap in the master suite had been disturbed in a circular pattern, which could indicate the use of a carpet cleaner.
Technicians also found a fine mist of blood spatter on the headboard of the couple's bed. The evidence was collected and forwarded to the crime lab for analysis. For investigators, the discovery of so much blood was not encouraging.
The amount of blood in the master suite was a significant amount of blood, and someone would have been at least direly wounded, if not deceased.
Though investigators believed that someone was Ruby Morris, they soon learned that the blood recovered from the house was too degraded for a definitive DNA analysis. Technicians began scouring Earl Morris's vehicle for clues. The search revealed the presence of several large bloodstains on the passenger side carpet. The samples were collected and sent out for DNA testing. Though the analysis would take time, police speculated that Earl Morris had murdered his wife, then transported her body in his El Camino. And that meant Ruby's body could be anywhere between Phoenix and San Diego. As investigators began the daunting task of trying to pinpoint Ruby's remains, one of the couple's daughters came forward with information. Earl owned a boat, and he kept it docked in San Diego. Believing there had to be a connection, police contacted authorities there. A few days later, San Diego Harbor Police forwarded a video cassette to Maricopa County investigators. The tape, shot the same day that Ruby was reported missing, showed a boat burning at sea. And authorities had positively identified it as belonging to Earl Morris. For detectives, the significance was clear.
We speculated that Earl rented another boat to tow out his boat and actually set it on fire to hide the body of Ruby and also the murder weapon at that time.
The boat ultimately sank in treacherous waters too deep to be recovered. Despite the clumsy lies Earl Morris was telling police, it looked like he just might get away with murder. Detectives in Maricopa County, Arizona, were convinced that Earl Morris had murdered his 49-year-old wife, Ruby, and then entombed her in a watery grave several hundred miles away off the California coast. But without a weapon or the victim's body, they would have to rely on the forensic evidence to prove murder. And first, they would have to show that blood found in Earl's El Camino belonged to his wife. With no known samples from Ruby to compare to the evidence, examiners turned to a process called reverse paternity typing, which isolates strands of DNA that pass unchanged from mother to child. Maricopa County Sheriff's Crime Lab Supervisor James Serpa then compared the genetic profile of the samples collected from the El Camino to those generated from Ruby's two daughters and from her siblings.
The blood stain on the carpet of the El Camino was the mother of Ruby's children and the sibling of Ruby's brother and sister.
Though their case was largely circumstantial, investigators arrested Earl Morris and charged him with murder. Through his lawyer, Earl refused to make any statements. As the trial approached, investigators struggled to come up with more incriminating evidence against Earl Morris. But they found little else. Then, word came in that Earl Morris wanted to talk. He admitted he had been lying to authorities, but he said it wasn't to cover up his wife's murder. Ruby, he said, had killed herself. Earl said that in the early morning hours of June 4th, he entered the master bedroom and found Ruby dead, clutching the couple's .22 caliber pistol in her hand. Blood was everywhere. Wanting to spare the family the embarrassment of the suicide, he cleaned up the room and drove her body to San Diego, where he then disposed of the remains. He thought it would be easier for the family to accept that Ruby had decided to just up and leave. Though the account sounded ridiculous to police, they realized that Earl's suicide story had the potential to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. Unless investigators could come up with hard evidence to prove otherwise, Earl Morris could be a free man. And without the ability to examine the victim's body, it would be difficult to disprove Earl's story. Lieutenant Commander Rod Engler, an expert in bloodstain pattern analysis, was brought in to assist in the investigation. Englert and Serpa began by re-examining the headboard collected from the couple's bedroom. When luminol was applied, Englert had no doubt that the blood spatter present, which appeared as fine mist, had resulted from a specific type of injury.
Well, when there's crimes of violence, blood is categorized into three major categories. The low category, which is termed low velocity impact spatters, just drops of blood, smears of blood, transfer stains. The second category is from blunt trauma, which is termed medium velocity. And the third category, which we're dealing with in this particular case, is high velocity, which is a specific, easily identified pattern, which is atomization of blood. And that comes from gunshot.
The location of the spatter on the headboard also allowed examiners to determine the position of the victim's head at the time she was shot. Ruby had been lying flat, in a sleep-like position.
If that's the case, and if this is...
Though the finding was suspicious, on its own it did not contradict Earl Morris's suicide story. After thoroughly photographing the bloodstains, Englert began looking for any abnormalities in the patterns. Something immediately caught his attention.
As you look at the headboard, a left to right direction, you have a pattern of blood going up that direction. You have another pattern of blood overlapping it and going another direction. So you have there two conditions that don't occur at the same time.
The bloodstain patterns indicated that Ruby had been shot at least twice. And if she had taken her own life, as Earl claimed, that would have been difficult to do.
Well, first of all, Ruby Morris would have to been able to cock the hammer on the gun, which I'm told was a single action revolver 22 after a shot to the head to a large source of blood. Would have to be able to cock it again and possibly even a third time. And that's not likely.
Investigators agreed. Based on the forensic analysis, there could be little doubt that Ruby Morris had been murdered. Police believe that to avoid the financial ruin from a divorce, Earl Morris chose to kill his wife. As Ruby lay sleeping in the couple's bed, he pulled out the .22 caliber pistol and shot her several times in the head. After cleaning up the crime scene, he loaded her bleeding body into his El Camino and drove several hundred miles away to San Diego. Once there, he loaded her body and likely the murder weapon onto his boat. He set the craft on fire, returned to shore, and began the process of covering up his crime. With the help of Rod Englert's blood spatter analysis, Earl Morris was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Earl Morris tried to explain his wife's death by creating a story about suicide. But sometimes murderers admit killing their victims. And the story they tell investigators is one of self-defense. Around 1:30 a.m. on October 18, 1984, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department received a frantic 911 call. 24-year-old Brett Harris said that his mother, Barbara, had been murdered. His stepfather, Bob Giesler, was also dead. Distraught, Brett was threatening to take his own life. Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies raced to the scene. As they approached the house, they made a bizarre discovery. A man, identified as Brett Harris, was hiding in a tree. After talking him down, one of the officers made his way into the residence. Come on over here. Come on out. In the master bedroom, he discovered a gruesome scene. A woman lay dead on the mattress. And on the floor nearby was another lifeless body. Officers from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department were dispatched to the home of 52-year-old Bob Giesler and his 55-year-old wife, Barbara. The couple had been brutally murdered. Investigators questioned Barbara's son, Brett Harris, who had called 911. After some time, he was able to recount what had happened. Brett said that around 1:30 a.m., he heard a commotion, and then a scream coming from his parents' bedroom. When he entered their room, he saw his stepfather standing above his lifeless mother. He saw an axe handle lying on the floor. As he went to grab it, his stepfather then attacked him with a box cutter. Brett said he managed to overpower him, and in self-defense, he beat his stepfather to death. The young man was transported to the police station. Evidence technicians made their way into the bedroom. According to crime scene unit investigator Brian Kennedy, both victims had been savagely beaten.
Their heads and faces were grotesquely disfigured, and there were bloodstains all over every surface. At one time, the air must have been filled with atomized mist or droplets of blood falling out of the air. It was quite a horrendous sight.
Technicians began looking for evidence to help them reconstruct what had happened inside the room. In addition to the axe handle, investigators also recovered a blood-stained box cover found resting on Bob Giesler's chest. All of the bloodstain patterns were carefully photographed. As the search of the house continued, officers followed a trail of bloody shoe prints that led from the bedroom to the kitchen. The trail stopped in front of an opened utility drawer. Unsure what to make of the findings, officers created a visual record of the evidence. At the police station, investigators struggled to obtain coherent answers from Brett Harris. He was unresponsive to their questions and began rambling on about the devil and other things that made little sense. Officers photographed several superficial wounds on his body. Police also collected his blood-stained clothes. With so many unanswered questions, police hoped autopsies of the victims could tell them more. The medical examiner concluded that Bob and Barbara Hiesler had both died from massive blunt force trauma to the skull. The beatings had been so savage that both the victims' arms had been broken while defending themselves during the assaults. Special Assistant Attorney General David Drewliner followed the investigation. For him, the autopsy findings were troubling.
The viciousness with which the two individuals were killed, Harris's mother and his stepfather, was extremely similar. And so had the stepfather been the killer of his own wife, and then Harris been the killer of the stepfather, you wouldn't have expected necessarily it to have been in such an identical manner.
Authorities couldn't ignore the possibility that one person had committed both murders. If Brett Harris was responsible for the vicious double homicide, investigators needed to find out what could have motivated such rage. They turned to family members for information. Brett's stepsister told detectives that her stepmother and father had always maintained a good relationship with Brett. Though Brett would sometimes find himself facing legal problems, his mother and stepfather would always look out for him, bailing him out of jail on a number of occasions. Brett's stepfather even employed him at his tool-making company in hopes that the young man would find himself. Though Brett suffered from a psychiatric condition, his stepsister said that he had made progress in recent months, and with the help of medications, his prospects for the future were promising. She added that Bob and Barbara's relationship was strong, and she could not imagine that her father would ever hurt her stepmother. Nothing investigators had learned jibed with Brett Harris's version of events. Believing the 24-year-old was hiding something, they turned to examiners at the Sacramento County Sheriff's Crime Lab for answers. There, examiner Brian Kennedy looked to the blood evidence to help him reconstruct the crime.
This was an interesting case where we had 3 people in a house where only one person came out alive, and he had a story. The story was not completely and totally impossible. In piecing it all together, I tried to support his story. I actually looked at it to see if I could prove him correct.
But in one of the photographs taken in the bedroom, Kennedy noticed something odd. Though the entire room had been saturated with the victim's blood, the carpet underneath the stepfather's body was clean. For Kennedy, there seemed to be only one way to explain that fact.
He goes down onto the floor, and he's incapacitated and shields the floor from any blood that would come from his wife. And so we know that he's down first because she's then attacked and her blood covers the rest of the room. And we can put her blood on top of him, but we can't put it underneath him.
The finding contradicted Brett's story that his mother had already been bludgeoned and was bleeding by the time he entered the room. With the evidence now pointing to Brett Harris as his mother's killer, Kennedy began analyzing bloodstains on his clothing for proof. But serological tests showed that all the blood on his clothes had originated from the stepfather. Kennedy now wondered if it was possible for Brett to have bludgeoned his mother while avoiding getting her blood on him. To find out, he devised a blood spatter experiment. Simulating the assailant's position, he began striking sponges soaked with blood with a wooden instrument, looking to see how the resulting blood spatter would stain his clothing. The result surprised him.
The first couple blows, I actually turned my head to the side so I wouldn't get a full face of spatter. And I found out I wasn't getting anything. I just started relaxing and letting it go. I started beating it even harder, and it was all going out to the sides. Very little was coming back at me, if any.
Kennedy had successfully demonstrated that Barbara's assailant could have avoided being spattered by her blood. And coupled with the other findings, it was clear that Brett Harris's story was a lie.
So the bottom line is, the two deceased people who couldn't speak for themselves spoke volumes with the bloodstain patterns that were produced from them. And I was unable to support or substantiate anything that the defendant had said.
After being charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, Brett Harris underwent a psychiatric evaluation. He now admitted to both killings, but claimed it was in self-defense. After explaining that his parents were possessed by warlocks, Brett Harris entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Though Brett had been previously diagnosed with a mental condition, prosecutors believed the story he was now telling was just a desperate attempt to escape justice.
He wasn't insane. And by that I mean, did he know what he was doing? Did he know that he actually was killing human beings? And did he know that it was wrong? And there was no doubt as to the answer to those questions was yes and yes. He knew it was wrong. Otherwise, why did he call 911 immediately after? He knew it was a crime.
But to win a murder conviction, authorities needed to find physical proof that the cold-blooded murders were not the result of an insane mind. Forensic examiners in Sacramento, California, had proven that 24-year-old Brett Harris had brutally bludgeoned his mother and stepfather to death. After being charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, the suspect told psychiatrists that warlocks possessed both Bob and Barbara Giesler, and he killed the couple in self-defense. Brett Harris entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. To prove that he was lying in order to avoid the death penalty, authorities turned once again to the forensic evidence. Examiner Brian Kennedy began looking at all the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, looking for anything that could demonstrate that Brett Harris knew what he was doing at the time of the murders. He focused on the box cutter found on Bob Giesler's chest. After reviewing the autopsy reports, Kennedy believed it was unlikely that the box cutter could have been used as a weapon against Brett, as he had previously claimed.
Both of our victims had broken arms. If you're defending yourself with your arms and you've got holding something and it's severe enough to break the arm, you're going to lose control of whatever's in your hand, most likely. I doubt seriously you can hang on to it. For somebody to have their arm broken and place it on their chest is not likely.
Believing that Brett Harris had staged the crime scene to throw investigators off his trail, Kennedy next looked for a way to explain the box cutter wounds found on his body.
This looks like somebody has self-inflicted these injuries because they're in the right place. For a right-handed person to cut himself on the left arm, to cut himself on the right cheek, to cut himself from left to right across his chest. So it's all very consistent with staging his own injuries.
The forensic findings provided irrefutable proof that Brett Harris had gone to great lengths to conceal his guilt. And for prosecutors, those are not the actions of an insane man.
He physically changed the crime scene in anticipation that the police were coming to the crime scene. So he tries to fool law enforcement. Why do it? Why come up with any sort of an explanation? He wouldn't have to.
Though unsure of the motive, police believe that on October 18, 1984, Brett Harris snuck into the couple's room as they slept in their bed. Using an axe handle, he bludgeoned Bob and Barbara Giesler to death. After finishing the kill, he made his way into the kitchen, sliced himself with a box cutter he took from the utility drawer, and returned to the bedroom to plant the evidence. Confronted with the evidence, Brett Harris withdrew his insanity defense. He pled guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 41 years to life. Killers skilled at the art of deception hope to confuse investigators by manipulating a crime scene. But forensic experts can find justice for victims of homicide by seeing through a murderer's lies, which are written in tainted blood. A New Jersey woman is found brutally murdered by the side of the road. Investigators must make their case from a few bite marks left on the victim's body. A sadistic predator targets young women in a quiet Canadian community. As police struggle to track him down, the killer threatens more victims. Indiana firefighters discover a woman murdered in her bed. But will dental impressions be enough to convict her killer? Some murderers are compelled to leave a very personal mark on their victims. But with the help of forensic odontologists, police can use those marks to capture those who kill with a deadly smile. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Just after midnight on August 12, 1994, police in Woodbridge, New Jersey were dispatched to a remote area just off Route 1. A battered, semi-nude woman, identified as 25-year-old Melissa Padilla, had been found murdered, lying inside a concrete pipe. Crime technicians began processing the area for clues. They collected several recently purchased grocery items scattered near the body. They also recovered a blood-stained dollar bill and nearby several cigarette butts, which investigators hoped would yield valuable DNA evidence. The victim's discarded shorts, stained with blood, were found nearby. Inside one of the pockets was a store receipt for several grocery items, time-stamped 11:29 p.m. While evidence technicians continued processing the scene, Melissa's boyfriend, Hector Gonzalez, who had found her body, was brought in for questioning. He couldn't imagine anyone who would want to hurt Melissa, a dedicated mother of 4. Hector said that after putting the kids to bed around 11 p.m., Melissa said she wanted to go to a nearby convenience store to pick up a few things. Hector agreed to watch the kids. She said she would be back within a half hour.
Thank you.
When she hadn't returned more than an hour later, he became concerned and asked a friend to help look for her. That's when they found Melissa's battered body along Route 1, the path she normally took to go to the store. Hector later agreed to take a polygraph examination. Test results indicated he had nothing to do with Melissa's murder. Though police had no obvious suspects, the motive behind the murder seemed clear. Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office Lieutenant Lawrence Nagel worked the case.
The woman that was found at the scene was found naked from the waist down. It appeared there was severe trauma to her face area. Initial impressions were that it appeared to be a sexual type of situation.
At autopsy, the medical examiner concluded that Melissa Padilla had died of manual strangulation. Her face had been viciously beaten. Though it was clear she had been sexually assaulted, no biological evidence was recovered. More disturbing was the presence of small contusions on the victim's body. The ones found on Melissa's chin appeared to be bite marks. Knowing the bite marks would be crucial in linking a suspect to the crime, an identification officer with the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office precisely photographed them to scale, using standards developed by the American Board of Forensic Odontologists. For the bite mark evidence to be useful, investigators had to identify a suspect. Trying to retrace Melissa's movements, investigators retrieved the security camera videotape from the store Melissa had been to just before her death. Melissa was clearly visible, purchasing the items found near her body. The amount of change she was seen receiving was the same amount found in her pocket. But no one who appeared in the video looked suspicious. Analysis of the items recovered from the crime scene had little else to offer. Though DNA was found on the cigarette butts, investigators had no way to determine who had left them there or when. And all of the blood that was collected belonged to Melissa. A meticulous search for any suspect fingerprints turned up nothing. Despite the lack of clues to the killer's identity, the bite marks he left behind gave investigators a glimpse into his violent mind. Assistant Prosecutor Thomas Capsack of the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office worked the case.
The nature of the crime suggested anger. The victim was really brutalized. There had to be a lot of pain involved, and we eventually concluded that the bite mark on the chin occurred while he was looking into her eyes while he was causing pain.
Police began focusing their attention on sex offenders known to be living in the area. A state prison facility housing such offenders was located just a few miles from the crime scene. And several inmates had recently been released. Investigators tracked each one of them down. All denied knowledge of Melissa Padilla's murder. and all were eventually cleared by polygraph examinations. Investigators scoured dozens of homicide cases looking for one with a similar MO. But despite their efforts, 8 months passed with no progress in the investigation of Melissa Padilla's murder. But in April 1995, investigators received a call from the Maine State Police. Authorities there were requesting background information on a Woodbridge, New Jersey resident, 31-year-old Stephen Fortin, who was in their custody for sexually assaulting a female Maine State Trooper. For Lieutenant Nagel, the details of the assault sounded eerily familiar.
It was revealed during a conversation with the Maine State Police that the trooper during the assault by Stephen Fortin was bitten in the same immediate areas that Melissa Padilla was bitten on.
Hoping this was the break they had been waiting for, investigators traveled to Maine to speak with the trooper, who was still recovering in the hospital. Investigators immediately noticed that the trooper had sustained bite marks on her chin, the same spot where Melissa Padilla had been bitten. The off-duty trooper said she saw a car parked on the side of the road, facing oncoming traffic.
Open the window.
Concerned, she pulled over.
You having trouble with your car tonight?
The driver claimed to be having mechanical problems, but the trooper noticed the strong alcohol smell.
Okay, stand right there. Okay, don't move. Don't move. Okay.
She administered a breathalyzer test, which confirmed that the man was intoxicated. As the trooper radioed into the station for backup, the man suddenly attacked her from behind and knocked her unconscious. When she came to, she was in the passenger seat of her patrol car. She was in a great deal of pain and suddenly realized she had been sexually assaulted while unconscious. Believing the assailant was planning to kill her, the trooper jumped out of the car. The driver continued on. The next thing she remembered was waking up in the hospital. Her assailant, Stephen Fortin, was taken into custody less than an hour later. After examining and photographing the trooper's injuries, one thing became clear. The assault on the state trooper and the murder of Melissa Padilla bore the same ritualistic signature.
Ritual involves getting sexual gratification from the crime you commit. The signature in our case really was the ritual, and that is the beating to the eyes and the nose, the bite mark on the chin.
Come over here and check.
For investigators, the similar MO of the two assaults had to be more than just a coincidence. New Jersey police went to the jail in Kennebec County, Maine, to question Fortin about the Melissa Padilla homicide. Though Fortin admitted to living in Woodbridge, New Jersey at the time, he insisted he didn't know anyone named Melissa Padilla and denied any knowledge of her murder. He also denied ever being in the area along Route 1, where Melissa's body was found. But he didn't deny his involvement in the assault on the female trooper, though he claimed he had acted in self-defense. Investigators collected hair and blood samples to compare to evidence recovered from the Melissa Padilla crime scene. Though investigators finally had a strong suspect in the young woman's homicide, they were still a long way from proving that Stephen Fortin was her killer. With only bite mark evidence to work with, police in Woodbridge, New Jersey struggled to solve the brutal murder of Melissa Padilla, a 25-year-old mother of 4. After several months with no leads, police learned of a similar assault more than 300 miles away in Maine. The suspect in that case, Stephen Fortin, had recently moved there from Woodbridge. authorities interviewed Fortin's friends and associates. They located an ex-girlfriend who still lived in Woodridge. She had plenty to say about Steve Fortin. She said their turbulent 4-month relationship suddenly came to a violent halt after Fortin assaulted her during an argument they had while taking a walk along Route 1. She added that after their fight, Fortin returned to apologize. The girlfriend noticed cuts and scratches on Fortin's face and hands. Fortin explained that he feared she had called the police, and he fled through the woods to avoid them. She believed the incident had taken place on August 12th. Not only was that the night Melissa was murdered, but the girlfriend had put Fortin on Route 1, an area he previously claimed he had never been to. Though investigators were now convinced that Fortin was Melissa Padilla's killer, DNA analysis on the cigarette butt found near her body was inconclusive. Examiners analyzed all of the evidence found at the crime scene again, hoping something may have been overlooked. But nothing was found. For Identification Officer Jim O'Brien, it was clear that the bite marks would be the crucial link connecting Stephen Fortin to Melissa's murder.
The DNA results were inconclusive. We had no hairs or fibers from Stephen Fortin found on the victim's body, and I never developed any fingerprints on any of the evidence that came back to anyone except the victim herself. Therefore, the photographs of the bite marks on the victim's body were very, very important in terms of physical evidence and in terms of putting Stephen Fortin at this crime scene.
In April 1995, Stephen Fortin was taken to the office of Dr. Brian Morin, a dentist in Waterville, Maine. To prove Fortin had made the bite marks on Melissa's body, investigators first needed models detailing every unique feature of his teeth. First, photographs of the suspect's teeth are taken using a millimeter ruler, so examiners can accurately determine the scale of the photos for later comparisons to pictures of the victim's injuries. Then, impressions of the upper and lower teeth are taken using a substance called dental stone, a material similar to plaster. After the molds are allowed to harden, Morin then grinds them down to remove excess material, allowing examiners to clearly see the unique features of the teeth. The molds of the suspect's teeth, in addition to life-size photographs of the bite mark injuries, are all examiners need to perform the analysis. Dr. Tom Richardson, a forensic odontologist in Portland, Maine, explains the process.
The molds of teeth are the casts. They are the likeness of the individual's teeth in size and in shape. The photos are from the individual or medium that was bitten, and they are life size as well. We take the casts, put an overlay, go up against the marks on the photo, and we either are going to have a match if the photos are good and the marks are there, or we're not going to.
Using a computer program, examiners demonstrated how the casts made of Stephen Fortin's teeth lined up perfectly with the bite marks on the victim's chin. The spacing between Fortin's teeth, the dimensions of the arches of his bite, and the unique details of his teeth were all consistent with the injuries on both victims. Detectives now had the physical proof they needed to charge Stephen Fortin with the murder of Melissa Padilla. Police believe that Stephen Fortin chanced upon Melissa as she returned from the convenience store. Still enraged by the argument with his girlfriend, Fortin brutally beat, bit, and sexually assaulted her before finally strangling her to death. In February 2001, He was sentenced to death in New Jersey for the murder and aggravated sexual assault of Melissa Padilla. He also pled guilty to charges stemming from the beating and sexual assault on the Maine state trooper. He received the maximum 20-year sentence. Stephen Portman found gratification in a brutal ritual. In Canada, in a quiet suburb of Vancouver, one killer took perverse satisfaction from taunting the detectives on his trail. Abbotsford, British Columbia, Canada, October 14, 1995. In the early morning hours, officers from the Abbotsford Police Department were dispatched to a hospital emergency room. There, they found 16-year-old Melissa Connor, still recovering from a brutal beating she sustained a few hours earlier. Melissa told investigators that she and a friend, Tracy Sawyer, were on their way to a party when a man wielding a baseball bat jumped out of the bushes and attacked them. During the struggle, Melissa was knocked unconscious. When she came to, Tracy and the assailant were nowhere in sight. Though her recollection of the attack was still a bit hazy, Melissa was certain she had never seen the man before. Investigators rushed to the scene of the assault to search for Tracy. But only one item found at the scene suggested that a struggle had taken place. A single hoop earring that belonged to the missing teenager. Inspector Rod Gale of the Abbotsford Police Department hoped a canvass of the neighborhood would yield information.
There were witnesses in the area of the crime scene, but the witnesses that we established there had only heard screams in the early hours of the morning, and no one had actually seen anything.
Okay. Investigators feared that the 16-year-old Tracy Sawyer had been abducted, or worse. And with no suspects to pursue, they knew that time was working against them. A description of the missing teenager and details of the assault were distributed to all area law enforcement agencies. A few hours later, a man fishing along the Vedder River noticed something on the riverbank. As he moved closer to get a better look, he realized he had found a human body. Officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who responded to the scene found that the young female victim had been savagely beaten and raped. Police scoured the shoreline for clues that could help them identify the young woman and her killer. But they found nothing. Still, officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police believe this was the missing Abbotsford girl. Sergeant Kevin McLeod.
The obvious connection to me to the Abbotsford case was the fact that Abbotsford had a missing girl and we had a dead girl. And this is close vicinity of the two communities.
Dental records confirmed that the woman found at the Vedder River was Tracy Sawyer. The medical examiner confirmed that the young woman had been raped. He also noted massive blunt force trauma to her head. But that wasn't what killed her. The official cause of death was ruled a drowning. The only clues to the killer's identity were bite marks on the victim's torso. The impressions were carefully photographed and preserved as evidence. The photos were sent to the Bureau of Legal Dentistry Laboratory in Vancouver. There, Dr. David Sweet, a recognized expert in forensic odontology, examined the evidence. After studying the bite mark injuries, He realized there was the potential for additional evidence to be obtained.
A new technique was available for recovering saliva from a bite mark, and we could even determine if DNA was available from the saliva, and then possibly match that back to the suspect when and if one was made available.
The theory behind the technique, referred to as double swabbing, is that saliva from the suspect's mouth is transferred into the bite marks left on the victim. As demonstrated here, Dr. Sweet first dampens a sterile swab with distilled water, then wipes it across the impressions, rehydrating any saliva cells in the bite marks. Then, he applies a second dry swab to the wounds, which will act as a sponge and collect the rehydrated cells that contain the suspect's DNA. Dr. Sweet performed the procedure on the teeth impressions found on Tracy Sawyer. And though she had been submerged in water for some time, he was confident the double swabbing technique would yield DNA evidence.
Despite the fact that the body had been in water, the saliva is sticky enough in order to remain there, and if you can use some methods to collect that evidence that's there, even in trace forms, you'll have enough to test and to analyze.
The procedure was successful. Minute traces of the killer's DNA was collected. But for that evidence to be useful, investigators would now have to find a way to identify a suspect. A forensic odontologist had successfully extracted the killer's DNA from bite marks found on 16-year-old murder victim Tracy Sawyer. But for the evidence to be useful, police in Abbotsford, British Columbia, now had to identify a suspect. They turned to the victim's parents for information. The couple said that the last time they saw Tracy was shortly before the assault. She and her friend Melissa Connor were leaving for a party at a neighborhood friend's house. They promised not to be out too late. Tracy seemed upbeat and excited about the party. That night she looked so happy. The couple couldn't think of a single person who would want to hurt their beautiful young daughter. In addition to releasing limited details of the investigation to the media, police also set up a tip line for potential witnesses to call with information. Soon after, a call came in. The man on the other end claimed to be Tracy's killer. He described in detail the bite mark found on the victim's body.
The only people that would know about it were the people at the autopsy, the doctors, the policemen attending the autopsy, and the immediate core team of the investigation. So it had to be the individual that had intimate knowledge of the crime scene to know about that bite mark.
Police traced the call to a nearby payphone and rushed to the scene. But no one was there. Technicians thoroughly dusted the phone for any fingerprints the suspect may have left behind. None were found. A short while later, Abbotsford police dispatchers received a 911 call. During the conversation, which was recorded by police, a man identified himself as the killer. He wanted to know if police were having trouble finding him. He said he would never be so stupid as to leave his prints on the payphone.
Hey, where are you gonna be?
He also promised to kill again.
Hello? Are you there?
It's not very often that a suspect starts phoning the police and threatening to attack again, threatening to do the same thing over again, and basically taunting that you're not going to be able to catch me, I'm going to do this again.
Desperate to stop this killer before he struck again, police turned back to Melissa Connor, the young woman who had survived the assault that had claimed the life of her best friend. Though her memory of the events had not fully recovered, she tried to describe the assailant to a sketch artist the best she could. She remembered the man as being a tall, white male, balding, but with reddish-brown hair. The information was enough for police to formulate a composite sketch, which was quickly released through the media. The press dubbed him the Abbotsford Killer. A few days later, a woman came forward with information. She recognized the man in the sketch. He appeared to be the same man who had attacked her with a baseball bat several months before. When shown a photo lineup, she picked out a man named John Eller. For the first time in the murder investigation, authorities had a viable suspect. In November 1995, more than a month after Tracy Sawyer's murder, detectives arrested John Eller at his home. He vehemently denied being the Abbotsford Killer. After taking impressions of the suspect's teeth, forensic odontologist Dr. David Sweet compared them to the bite marks found on Tracy Sawyer's body. But investigators would be frustrated by the results of his analysis.
It became obvious very quickly that the spacing and the shapes of his teeth were much different than the teeth that would be necessary to cause this bite mark.
And DNA samples from the suspect did not match the DNA Dr. Sweet had extracted from the bite marks. John Eller was eventually cleared as a suspect in Tracy's murder. Soon after, the taunting phone calls from the Abbotsford Killer resumed. Frustrated, authorities came up with a plan. Convinced that someone somewhere knew the killer, they decided to release the recordings of the Abbotsford Killer's taunting phone calls made to police.
The general public were able to hear a large variety of voice characteristics of the individual who was calling us, and that was our goal. We also had that tape on a callback line at the police office, so anybody could call a designated number and just listen to the tape. They didn't have to talk to a police officer. They could just phone and listen to the tape over and over again.
The plan appeared to be a success. A woman who listened to the recordings came forward. She recognized the voice. Detectives played the tape for her again. She told them it sounded like a man named Terry Driver. She knew the voice, she said, because Terry Driver was her son. And she knew that he owned a police scanner and listened to it often at his home. Detectives quickly began checking Driver's background. Though he had no criminal record, the 32-year-old printer lived with his wife and 2 kids in the same neighborhood where the taunting phone calls had originated. Terry Driver was brought in for questioning. Though Driver adamantly denied being the Abbotsford Killer, detectives collected hair and saliva for DNA analysis. Photographs and wax casts of Driver's teeth were also taken. At the Bureau of Legal Dentistry in Vancouver, Dr. Sweet looked for similarities between Driver's dental evidence and bite marks found on Tracy Sawyer's body.
I produced a clear overlay with the biting edges of his teeth recorded on it at life size, and then compared that to the photographs that were enlarged to life size also.
Dr. Sweet identified several unique characteristics in the suspect's bite that convinced him that Terry Driver's teeth were consistent with the bite marks on Tracy Sawyer's body.
He had some chipped teeth as well as some crowding or rotations of teeth so that they were out of position and not where you would normally find them. This made his teeth unique from everybody else's, and those features were recorded in the bite mark also.
But the irrefutable proof came from the DNA analysis. Terry Driver's DNA profile matched the profile of the DNA Dr. Sweet had extracted from the bite mark injuries. Dr. Sweet's double swabbing technique helped police clinch their case against a sadistic killer. Terry Driver was arrested and charged with the murder of 16-year-old Tracy Sawyer and the attempted murder of her friend, Melissa Connor. Based on the evidence, Abbotsford police believe Terry Driver was a sick predator driven by an insatiable need for attention. On October 14, 1995, that craving exploded into violence. As Melissa Connor and Tracy Sawyer made their way to a nearby party, Driver attacked them without warning. After viciously raping and killing Tracy, Driver set out to taunt police and to prove that he was invincible. In October of 1997, Terry Driver was convicted of the sexual assault slaying of Tracy Sawyer and sentenced to life in prison. He received an additional 10 years for the attempted murder of Melissa Connor. Terry Driver was compelled to call attention to his crimes. But in Indiana, another murderer went to great lengths to conceal his guilt. On October 6, 1990, at 11:37 p.m., firefighters in Shelbyville, Indiana, responded to a blaze at a nearby apartment complex. The fire was coming from the bedroom of 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill, a tenant who lived on the second floor. After extinguishing the fire on the bed, one of the firefighters made a grisly discovery: the badly burned body of a woman. And the strong smell of lighter fluid led rescue workers to conclude that this fire was no accident. After extinguishing a blaze in an apartment in Shelbyville, Indiana, firefighters had uncovered the badly burned remains of a woman lying in a bed. And according to Chief Kurt Etherton of the Shelbyville Police Department, all indications suggested she had been the victim of a homicide.
It appeared that fire had been started either on or around the bed. There was an inverted V pattern, which is consistent with a fire where accelerants had been used. So it was our opinion that the fire had been set at that point.
After confirming that the victim was the tenant, 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill, evidence technicians began searching for clues to tell them who had started the deadly blaze and why. Several latent prints were located and preserved as evidence. But later analysis revealed they all belonged to the victim. Investigators also collected 2 different brands of cigarette butts. DNA analysis later revealed the presence of 2 distinct DNA profiles, and neither matched the victim. It appeared Shirley Sturgill's killer, or killers, had unsuccessfully tried to burn away any trace of evidence from the crime scene. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Shirley had not died as a result of the fire. She had been strangled to death. She had also been sexually assaulted. But the biological evidence recovered was too degraded for a thorough analysis. And there was more. Several marks were found on the victim's torso, stomach, and thigh. The ME concluded they were bite marks made from human teeth. For investigators, they were the strongest link to Shirley's killer.
That person told us that if we had a suspect, that they could take impressions and he would be able to determine whether or not those bite marks were made by a particular person, because there were some distinctive markings on the bites that would be consistent with someone's teeth not being aligned straight.
What time was it when detectives began their hunt for Shirley Sturgill's killer by speaking with her daughter? Angie Carr said she and her mother were very close. She couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt her. She described her mother as a kind, sensitive, and selfless woman who dedicated her life to Angie's happiness and well-being. She was also a wonderful grandmother to Angie's young children. Angie had spoken to her mother on the phone just an hour or so before firefighters were called to the apartment. There didn't seem to be anything troubling her mother. The victim did mention during the conversation that her next-door neighbor, Jerry Donaldson, was there visiting at the time. It was a name already familiar to detectives. Arson investigators who had responded to Shirley's apartment the night of the murder said a neighbor was asking a lot of questions and seemed to know specific details of the crime itself. His name was Jerry Donaldson.
They said that the neighbor was telling several things about the crime that he felt no one else would probably know.
So when did you last? Donaldson was brought in for questioning. He admitted visiting Shirley the night she died. She had hurt her back recently, and he checked in on her periodically to see if she needed anything. He said they watched TV, and about 10:30, after smoking a cigarette, he went home. When asked how he knew so much about the murder, Donaldson claimed he'd overheard the firefighters talking. He agreed to provide hair samples for a DNA analysis. Donaldson's DNA was consistent with DNA recovered from one of the cigarette butts found in the victim's apartment. And though he had never denied being there, investigators were convinced he knew more about the murder than he claimed. On October 24th, nearly 3 weeks after Shirley Sturgill's murder, police arrested Jerry Donaldson on suspicion of murder. They also obtained a court order requiring impressions of his teeth to be made. A forensic odontologist overlaid impressions of the suspect's teeth over photographs of Shirley Sturgill's bite mark injuries. Though they didn't line up perfectly, the examiner felt that the two were consistent. But the suspect's lawyer saw to it that Donaldson would never stand trial for murder.
The defense team hired like 2 different odontologists from other parts of the country who had differing opinions than the odontologists we used. The prosecutor and his staff sat down with the defense team and went over the discrepancies, which eventually led to the release of the suspect.
For Shelbyville detectives, the setback was frustrating. The investigation into Shirley Sturgill's savage murder had ground to a halt. Investigators were back to square one, and with no obvious suspects to pursue. Shelbyville, Indiana police struggled to solve the brutal homicide of 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill. Though teeth marks had been found on the victim's body, investigators had no other clues to the killer's identity. A year after the homicide, the case was turned over to Captain Bill Dwenger.
One of the things that struck me as odd, it was the amount of anger or rage that was built up inside someone that could inflict these type of injuries on another human being.
After re-examining dozens of witness statements taken over the previous year, Dwenger noticed that several people had commented that Shirley and her son-in-law had not gotten along. Though that didn't seem so unusual, investigators decided to talk with Shirley's daughter Angie again, and to her husband, John Del Carr. John Del Carr was upfront about his feelings for his mother-in-law. He didn't like her, and they argued often. Mostly about Shirley's constant interfering with his marriage. He said that on the night of the murder, he was with an old army buddy who was visiting from out of town. He hadn't seen Shirley that day. Angie corroborated her husband's alibi. Though John Del Carr was still considered a suspect, police had no evidence against him. But a month later, detectives learned that John Del Carr had been arrested for murdering a young woman in nearby Hamilton County, Indiana. Though no bite marks were left on this victim, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The same M.O. as the murder of Shirley Sturgill. Shelbyville detectives drove to the state prison to speak with John Del Carr and obtain potential evidence. But the suspect was uncooperative and refused to answer any questions. The investigators ultimately collected hair and blood samples for DNA comparisons with evidence recovered from Shirley's apartment. At the crime lab, examiners concluded that John Del Carr's DNA was consistent with DNA from one of the cigarette butts found in Shirley's bedroom. John Del Carr had been at the victim's apartment, something he previously denied. Though it was strong circumstantial evidence, it didn't prove that he was the killer. There was only one way investigators could make their case. They needed impressions of John Del Carr's teeth to compare to the bite marks found on Shirley Sturgill's body. But so far, they lacked probable cause to obtain a warrant to force the suspect to provide the samples. And they knew that without that evidence, it would be difficult to get a conviction. Thank you.
We needed to know, and the jury's going to need to know, did we get his dental impressions? Did they match up to the bite marks on the body of Shirley Sturgill? Without that, I'm not sure a jury would be able to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So we needed that information, whether it was going to be, yes, they do match up, or no, they do not.
On August 3rd, 1994, almost 4 years after the murder, investigators finally got a break. Angie Carr had since divorced her husband, and now that he was in prison, she wanted to talk. She believed John Del Carr had in fact murdered her mother. She admitted to having lied to police before, but out of fear for her safety and the safety of her children. According to Angie, John came home very late the night of the murder. Suddenly, he grabbed a shotgun, pointed it at her, and told her he had hurt her mother.
You understand me? Go.
He dragged her to the room where her children were sleeping and threatened to kill her and them if she ever said anything. Angie told police that John kept up his threats in the following month. And she believed he wouldn't hesitate to carry them out.
John Carr's wife, I believe, was genuinely terrified of John. She knew what he was capable of. I think she did what she had to do to protect herself and her children.
It was the break detectives had been waiting for. Angie's testimony was enough for investigators to obtain a court order to force John Del Carr to give teeth impressions. Investigators contacted forensic odontologist Dr. John Kenny the deputy coroner for DuPage County, Illinois.
I was asked to go to the state prison and to meet with Mr. Carr in the dental infirmary and to take his impressions and any other records as I would need to make a bite mark comparison.
But John Del Carr still refused to cooperate. Investigators received another court order, this time giving them the authority to anesthetize the suspect in order to obtain the evidence.
It was possible in this particular case to, because of the configuration of Mr. Carr's teeth, several of his teeth were misaligned and crowded, particularly on the upper arch, to take the model of his teeth and fit it right to the injury in one of these positive replicas.
All of the unique characteristics of John Del Carr's teeth matched the injuries present on Shirley Sturgill's body. There was no doubt that his teeth had left the wounds. Police believe that on October 6, 1990, John Del Carr, resentful of his mother-in-law's interference in his marriage, drove to her apartment and confronted her. His anger exploded into violence. Carr beat, bit, and sexually assaulted Shirley Sturgill before strangling her to death. After, he set her apartment on fire, hoping all traces of his crime would burn away. In April 1997, John Del Carr was convicted of the first-degree murder of his mother-in-law, Shirley Sturgill. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Some killers are driven to leave a very personal mark on their victims. When police have little other evidence to work with, they turn to forensic odontologists, who seize upon those marks to take the bite out of a killer's deadly smile. In North Carolina, a Marine's estranged wife disappears without a trace. With no body and little physical evidence, naval investigators struggle to determine her fate. The remains of a young woman are found burning near a rural South Carolina road. For 5 years, her identity and that of her killer remain a mystery. In Virginia, a sailor in the United States Navy is found murdered in a vacant lot. Investigators must look among his shipmates to find the killer. Violence is an inescapable reality of contemporary life, and Navy sailors and U.S. Marines are not beyond its reach. When those who defend their country commit murder, it falls to special agents of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service to ensure that no one escapes military justice. North Carolina's Camp Lejeune is one of America's largest training grounds for the U.S. Marine Corps. But even here, where honor and loyalty are virtues, betrayal and murder exist. On March 27, 1999, Marine Corps Sergeant Quitman Wallace reported his estranged wife, 25-year-old Tanya, missing to military police. Though he and Tanya were separated, their 4-year-old daughter had been staying with him for a few days. Tanya was supposed to pick her up after she got off work the previous evening. But she never showed. Tanya's roommates hadn't seen her either, and they said that her vehicle was also missing. Whitman believed Tanya had run off with another man. case was turned over to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS. An elite civilian federal law enforcement organization whose mission is to protect and serve the Navy and Marine Corps and their families. Special Agent Robert Bratton, who headed up the major case response team, began the investigation into Tanya Wallace's disappearance.
There were some very real concerns about a mother of a 4-year-old child who was very close to her child leaving without any comment to the family that she was staying with at the time.
A few hours after the missing persons report was filed, word came in that Tanya's abandoned car had been found. Security guards at a nearby store had noticed it sitting in the parking lot since early that morning. An examination of the vehicle's exterior revealed the presence of small traces of human blood on the door handle. Agents and military police quickly spread out and began scouring the area for any signs of the young mother. But hours of searching failed to produce any clues to the missing woman's whereabouts. The vehicle was impounded for a more detailed analysis. Agents had to consider that with an impending divorce, Tanya Wallace might have gone missing on purpose. Looking for answers, agents went to check out her apartment and interview her roommates. One confirmed that recently Tanya had begun dating another man, but he was in the Navy and was currently deployed overseas. Tanya had made no mention of plans to travel. And since ending her relationship with the abusive Whitman Wallace, nothing seemed to be troubling her. The roommate added that since her split with Wallace, Tanya had become upbeat and excited about the new life she had ahead of her. She was committed to her daughter's happiness, and her roommate could not believe that Tanya would simply abandon her 4-year-old, leaving her estranged husband to raise her.
Based on interviews of her girlfriend that she was living with, the fact that she had never left the child alone for any period of time, in fact, was uncomfortable leaving her child with the father for any extended periods of time. We relatively quickly ruled out the idea that she had probably left with somebody willingly.
Before leaving, agents collected Tanya's toothbrush and a hairbrush for future DNA comparisons. Though agents remained hopeful that Tanya Wallace would turn up unharmed, all the signs were pointing to foul play. But so far, they had no physical proof that a crime had taken place. Sergeant Whitman Wallace was brought in for questioning. He insisted he had nothing to do with Tanya's disappearance. So they couldn't seem to make their marriage work. He still loved her and their 4-year-old daughter. He said that on the night Tanya disappeared, he had been assigned to work desk duty from 11 p.m. until early the next morning. He said he never left his post. Agents contacted Wallace's assistant, who also worked that evening. He confirmed that Wallace began his shift at 11 o'clock. But 30 minutes later, Wallace asked him to watch his desk. Wallace said his wife hadn't shown up to pick up their daughter, and he needed to go back home and look after her until Tanya arrived. Wallace left and eventually returned 2 hours later. Agents realized that Sergeant Wallace had lied when he claimed he never left work that night. Now, they needed to find out what he was trying to hide. They turned to the only piece of physical evidence they had. A week after she was reported missing, NCIS Special Agent and Forensic Consultant Mike Maloney began examining Tanya's vehicle.
As soon as we opened the door, it was obvious that there was a great deal of blood in the car. It couldn't be seen from the outside. The interior of the vehicle was very dark, dark colored carpet, dark colored seats and interior. But once we opened the door, it was apparent that there was blood.
The carpet revealed a large blood stain, approximately 16 inches long and 13 inches wide. Examiners removed it for a more detailed analysis. The DNA profile of the blood found in the vehicle matched those generated from the samples collected from Tanya's residence.
Hey, Bob.
It was clear that something violent had happened to Tanya. But without a body, agents were unable to prove that she was dead. Special Agent Mike Maloney devised a blood volume analysis experiment that could provide them with that proof.
We felt that we could show that she had lost so much blood in that vehicle that she couldn't possibly be alive.
Agent Maloney first needed to determine how much blood it would take to create the same size stains as those left on the vehicle's carpet. They obtained carpet samples from the vehicle manufacturer and saturated them with human blood. Examiners determined that 1,850 milliliters of human blood, or nearly 4 pints, was necessary to create a similar size stain. And that would be nearly half of Tanya Wallace's total blood volume. No one could have survived such severe bleeding without medical assistance. For agents, there was now no doubt that Tanya Wallace was dead. And they were equally convinced that her estranged husband, Sergeant Whitman Wallace, was responsible. But so far, they had no hard evidence to prove murder. With no body and only a blood-stained carpet to work with, forensic examiners of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service proved that missing 25-year-old Tanya Wallace was dead. And NCIS special agents believed her estranged husband, Marine Corps Sergeant Whitman Wallace, had killed her. But they lacked physical proof. And Wallace was no longer cooperating. Believing the suspect may have tried to throw away evidence of his guilt, agents began searching the dumpsters surrounding Wallace's barracks. But the trash had already been emptied. NCIS Special Agent Robert Bratton refused to give up. Though it seemed like a long shot, he contacted the area landfill, where all of the trash from the Camp Lejeune dumpsters is brought.
They can tell you where trash that's picked up and delivered that day or any particular day is within just a few feet. We asked them at that point to isolate the trash that was delivered on Monday and Tuesday of that week.
The Marines' Chemical Biological Incidents Response Force located that spot and began sifting through the mountain of debris. After hours of searching, the team found and collected a large green military-issue sweatshirt and some women's clothes. All of the items were covered with what appeared to be bloodstains. DNA tests on the items of clothing showed that all of the blood had originated from Tanya Wallace. And for Special Agent Mike Maloney, it appeared that Tanya had been wearing the clothing at the time of her death, except for one item, the green sweatshirt.
We were curious as to who the sweatshirt belonged to, though. The staining was on the outside of the sweatshirt and saturated to the inside, so we were fairly certain it wasn't something that Tanya was wearing the night that she was killed. We examined the neckband of the sweatshirt and also the armpits, and there was quite a bit of debris, of old skin cells, of sweat and sweat saturation.
Examiners were able to extract minute traces of DNA from the skin cells found on the sweatshirt. Analysis showed that the DNA was consistent with having come from Sergeant Whitman Wallace. Believing they were closing in on Tanya's killer, agents searched Wallace's barracks room. Wallace was in the process of moving out, and the place had been thoroughly cleaned. When agents applied luminol and darkened the room, large stains emerged on the tile floor.
Right, yeah.
Tests confirmed that the blood was human.
We got the red out, but that's all we got out. The hemoglobin's still there.
But the stains stopped abruptly where the carpet began. No blood was present beyond the tile flooring. Convinced Tanya had been murdered inside Whitman Wallace's barracks room, agents began interviewing other Marines who lived in the same complex.
Thanks. What do you have for?
One Marine recalled that a few days after Tanya was reported missing, Wallace paid him a visit.
It's probably no big deal.
He said that he had an inspection coming up, and the carpet in his room was muddy and it would never pass. Wallace asked to switch the carpets, and the barracks mate agreed. But after the inspection was complete, Wallace never returned to switch the rugs back.
I'll give you a call, all right? All right, later on, okay?
In fact, it was still lying on the Marine's floor.
You have his rug there? Yeah.
Hoping the rug contained the evidence they needed to prove Whitman Wallace was a killer, agents collected it and brought it to the lab for testing.
Got it.
Agent Maloney examined the carpet.
We did the luminol test, and we found the rest of the missing pattern from that stain by the door. They matched together perfectly, just like a puzzle piece. A very large saturation stain of what was later positively identified as blood on the carpet that matched that pattern that had been so sharply cut off on the tile floor.
DNA testing revealed that the blood on the rug, as well as the blood on the tile floor, was consistent with Tanya's. Agents now had enough evidence to make their case. Sergeant Whitman Wallace was placed under arrest and charged with murder. Based on the evidence, agents believed that Whitman Wallace was unwilling to give up custody of his daughter and was resentful of having to pay child support. On March 26, 1999, after getting off work, Tanya went to her estranged husband's barracks to pick up her daughter. Whitman Wallace had made sure he would be there when she arrived. With the couple's 4-year-old daughter asleep in the next room, Wallace savagely beat Tanya to death. He put her bleeding body into her vehicle, drove to a remote site, and buried her. At a general court-martial, Sergeant Whitman Wallace pled guilty to kidnapping and unpremeditated murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. And as part of the plea agreement, Wallace led authorities to Tanya's remains. Even without the victim's body, NCIS special agents were able to quickly expose the deadly violence of a Marine Corps sergeant. But in South Carolina, it would take naval investigators years to unravel one killer's deadly scheme. On November 6, 1989, a man